Conversations from the Cave is a raw self-help podcast dedicated to discussing men's issues. From pornography to parenting, from religion to real life, from learning to loving. We discuss the real issues that affect real men every day. Join us each week for powerful, revealing Conversations from the Cave. Now your host, Kirk Kennedy.
This is Conversations from the Cave. I am your host, Kirk Kennedy. It's a pleasure to have you with us again this afternoon. We're joined in studio by Attorney LeTonya Moore, who is a men's rights activist. In particular, her focus is on reintegrating fathers into the lives of their children. She's been involved in many things, and we'll get to that in the midst of our conversation. But welcome, Ms. Moore, to Conversations from the Cave.
Thank you for having me.
It's our pleasure. Of course, you are the inaugural woman to our show. You're the first woman to actually be in the cave. So this is kind of exciting to have you be part of this. And thank you for joining us. But we want to talk a little bit before we get into this second topic, which is what are the steps to sort of reintegrating or becoming reintegrated into the lives of your kids. We want to get some background as to why you're so passionate about this, first of all, for those who may not have heard your first time with us. And then can you give us a little bit of your background in terms of, how you've practiced and what sort of brought you to this point in your professional career?
Sure. So I guess I'll start with professional and end with personal. And so throughout my years of practice, I've always been in the area of civil rights. So that's really nothing new to me in terms of equal opportunity, equal access, looking at things in a fair and balanced way when it comes to our constitutional rights. Now, of course, we could probably have a conversation just about that.
Sure, absolutely. Mm-hmm.
This particular area I started to get interested in a few years back when, from just a personal note, I started to notice things like there were no resources, for example, for men and families or male-centered families that were victims of an abusive relationship, meaning the father was responsible for the children, but the mother was the abuser. So that was one thing. I had a family member who died as a result of an abusive relationship with a woman. And, I think men don't really, they really don't consider how dangerous women can be. So that was one aspect of it. But as far as the area of reintegrating fathers specifically, I'm a single.
Wait, before you move on, I actually want to pause right there. That's a very good point you make. You share that you actually had a family member die. You actually had a family member who was killed in a domestic violence experience. He was an individual who was killed by a woman that he had in his life. Were there signs before that? Were there things that he may have... What would you tell guys who are trapped in these types of relationships? I kind of want to sort of elucidate that a little bit more because we do have that. We have that more often than we know. And oftentimes our society tells us you can't fight back or you'll go to jail. You can't report it because cops won't believe you. You have guys who will put up with a lot of verbal and emotional and physical abuse from women who are, just very toxic in their lives, but they stay because of their children. What do you tell those guys? What would you share with them?
It's one of the toughest situations I believe that anyone can be in because not only is there no help, there is actually a negative view. Society has a negative view, or there's almost like an inherent disbelief, like you mentioned, if a reports. Because it's sort of like, really? So now there's an attack on your manhood, not just in a relationship capacity, but in the capacity of being a protector of your children. So everything about the essence of manhood is threatened.
Exactly.
You know what I'm saying? Like
yeah.
And so, to me, the sheer gravity of that really is and I don't diminish. I am in no way saying that women are not victims, but domestic violence is a family issue. It is not a gender issue.
That's right. That's right.
Issue, but it became a gender-based issue because there were certain laws in place at the time that literally allowed husbands to beat their wives. And I remember having this conversation with someone, and I told them, I said, go and research the rule of thumb. Now we just use it as a little colloquialism, and oh yeah, well, the rule of thumb is this. But the literal rule of thumb said that a husband was allowed to beat his wife as long as he didn't use a stick that was thicker than his thumb. That's what the rule of thumb is. That's where it came from. That's where it developed. So I understand that there had to be some systems put in place to counteract that type of societal acceptance of a husband beating a wife, a man beating a woman. I totally get that. But what has happened is we have created a culture that almost refuses to acknowledge that women can be abusers as well,
right.
Whether it's physical or what. We've created this culture, and now we refuse to accept the reality that women not only can be abusers, they are more likely, believe it or not, they are more likely to commit serious offenses against the children.
That's correct. Yeah. Go ahead. I didn't mean to cut across, but what you're saying, I think just having this type of discussion is almost fringing on the feminism dogma, because the belief is that there is this pristine, almost angelic quality to all women, and that there's a sinister quality to all men. And what you said at the beginning, I think, is so powerful and impactful, that this isn't a gender issue. Bad comes in any, bad can happen to anybody, male or female, and it can be dished out by anybody, male or female. And that the pendulum has now swung to where the female has been given what we would call a legal unfair advantage, even though the physical advantage may not necessarily be there in all cases, but they've been given a legal advantage. And that legal advantage makes it very difficult for men to launch safety campaigns and to protect their children, which is part of the priest, provider, protector role of men in the lives of their children. And you make a very good point when you talk about the emotional ramifications. It's much more difficult for a man to extricate himself from a violent or a narcissistic woman, because you're dealing with the fact that you oftentimes can report a crime and it's not believed. You'll report the crime, and many times the man is still removed from the home, even if he reports the crime against him and the children. And then oftentimes you'll find that women, when they go to say a healthcare provider, can oftentimes do self-infliction of wounds, and those things can immediately remove a man from a home without even having an opportunity to discuss it. A man can be removed from the home. And that, I think, is something that most guys, when they're going into relationships with women, especially relationships where they may not have considered children at the beginning of that relationship, they don't realize how toxic things can become, and they don't realize how exposed they can be. And I think that's the first point that we need to make, is that you have a certain amount of legal exposure because there's preferential treatment of women through the legal system. So I just wanted to elucidate that particular point. Excellent point. The second thing that you mentioned, and I wanted to see if we can have you further elucidate that point. So when we don't see those resources, do you find that men tend to stay in a more toxic relationship for longer, but believing that this is how men show that they're strong? Or do you feel that there is, what should be a man's choice in this particular scenario where there's an abusive narcissistic woman? What should be their response?
Well, it's interesting, because what should be is unfortunately it can't be. Okay. They should be able to have, the new term is called safe space. And safe space means that I can open myself up and give you my vulnerabilities with no judgment. So there should be a judgment-free zone where these guys can go and get the support that they need. They can go and get the resources that they need for themselves and for their children. But unfortunately, it is not out there. I'll give you something, another nugget that you may or may not have known, is that federal funding for domestic violence shelters not only don't cover men. If a man is a victim, whether it's a man that's a victim of a woman or a male or a same-sex relationship, that's number one. But number two, what's even more shocking is the fact that if your male child is of a certain age, he cannot stay at the shelter. But if your female child is that same age, she can stay at the shelter.
Wow. So there isn't even, a mechanism by which a man maybe I should ask. So are there any ways that men now can start to look into providing safe space? Are there things that are now becoming available, or is that something we need to really hunker down and push for?
I think we need to really hunker down and push for it. There are pockets of, I call them dad communities.
Okay.
There are, but within those communities, they are very few that are geared towards abuse. So I say that in the sense that I cannot tell you where there is a father shelter within a 50-mile radius. It may not even be one in a 100-mile radius. They almost don't exist. And so that's the other part, because when you have something like a shelter, you have to have funding, because there's so much that goes into that. There's counseling, there is employment training, there are all these different mechanisms, which is it's like an entire resource center. Your children are taken care of. You have family counseling, with yourself and the children. There's so many services that are there. Unfortunately, a lot of them are not available just for fathers.
Is there, I guess my question is, when we think about the fact that those things are not available for fathers, is that because men oftentimes underreport, or is it that bias that we talked about earlier?
I believe that it's because of the bias, but it's because when all of these laws were created, it was created behind a very strong, very effective pro-woman lobby. And just like with anything else, it was something that was a line in the sand, because remember, it was to take away that line in the sand that allowed certain things to occur. And so what has happened, we have started to see the rise and the strides and the advances of women after these laws have been enacted. But I believe that they literally will not consider the fact that there's also a high degree of women that are now becoming the aggressors, and they are literally doing the things that the men were doing many years ago, because the cycle of violence is the same, whether it's a man or a woman. It's just women have certain methods that they choose, and men have certain methods that they choose. May we talk a little bit more specifically? Let's talk about that, because I think a lot of guys may not understand some of the warning signs to protect themselves early on in an abusive relationship with a woman. Let's talk about that specifically for guys. We know that guys tend to be physically more aggressive in general, but let's talk about how some of those methodologies in women, because I don't know that guys know that. Well, I think the first thing that you have to look at is this element of control. Right. Okay. You talk about control, you talk about things like insecurity. Is it because some people, for whatever reason, they like for someone to be jealous? That's perplexing in and of itself. Yeah. But when it goes to the level of control, something's wrong. Okay. I need to always know where you are every second of the minute of the day. I need to always know who you're talking to on the phone. So that then usually develops into a blocking, meaning that now you're starting to be ostracized or isolated is a better word, from your family, from your friends. No one can come to the house, and you can't go anywhere unless I'm going with you. Let's talk about it in a parental context. I don't want you to talk to your child's mother unless I'm in the room. I don't want you to go and pick your child up unless I'm with you. So when you start to look at controlling movement. I want to add another one. If your woman decides to pick out clothes to make sure you match. I was going there next.
Yeah, I knew it. And the thing is, it seems quaint, but it's another form of control. It is. Those things are, areas